Good afternoon, everybody. Great to see you all here for this fireside chat with Sir Nigel Shadbolt. Just going to give people maybe a couple of minutes to get onto the webinar. It sometimes takes a little while for people to get logged in, and then we'll make a start. And as you are joining, in time-honored style, please do tell us where you're joining from. It's always really good to find out where people are based around the world, or indeed the companies that they work for, or organisations that they work for. So yeah, please do feel free to share in the chat. Hello, Bahrain. Hello to Lincoln. Please do add your name and your organisation and your location if you wish to. In the chat. We like to run these webinars in a really interactive way. We quite often have people interacting between each other during the sessions. And if we mention any documents or reports or research in the course of the session, we will try our very best to make sure that we put the links to those pieces in the chat as well. Okay, I'm going to make a start. Thanks ever so much for joining us today, everyone. My name's Emma Thwaites from the Open Data Institute. And this webinar is being recorded. So I just wanted to let everybody know that that's what we do. That's our practice. We will be sharing it on social media, in our email newsletter, and then it's going to be archived on the ODI website and YouTube channel. So we might be using quotes and extracts from the recording for this in future ODI communications. If you would like to ask a question, please add it into the chat section at any stage, and we'll get through as many as we can at the end. So I am delighted to welcome our guest for today's webinar. He is probably needs very little introduction to most of you joining us. Professor Nigel Shadbolt is Executive Chair of the Open Data Institute, which he co-founded with Sir Tim Berners-Lee in 2012. He's one of the UK's foremost computer scientists and a leading researcher in artificial intelligence. In November 2025, Nigel was appointed to the role of chair of AI at Oxford Research. It's a bit of a tongue twister, Nigel. That's a new role to champion and coordinate Oxford's world-class research in AI. Nigel is currently completing his successful tenure as the principal of Jesus College, Oxford, where his achievements included leading the £40 million redevelopment of Northgate House into the Cheng Yu Tung building, a digital hub with student accommodation, community events, and teaching facilities. In 2009, then Prime Minister Gordon Brown appointed Sir Nigel and Sir Tim as information advisors to transform access to public sector information. This work led to the National Data Library, which was previously known as data.gov.uk, a site that now provides a portal to tens of thousands of data sets. In 2010, Nigel joined the UK government's Public Sector Transparency Board, overseeing open data releases across the public sector, and he continues to advise the government in a number of roles. In 2025, he was appointed to the Council for Science and Technology, which advises the Prime Minister and the Cabinet on strategic science and technology policy issues. In May 2024, Nigel published As If Human: Ethics and Artificial Intelligence, co-written with Roger Hampson, which provides a new approach to the challenges surrounding AI. Nigel was knighted in 2013 for services to science and engineering, and we are delighted that he is joining us today to talk about this all-important topic, or topics, of sovereign data and sovereign AI. Nigel, over to you.
Thanks very much, Emma, and it's great to be with you. Yeah, so we try in these webinars to kind of take a topic that's a broad relevance and interest across the data ecosystem. And in the age of AI and much talk of sovereign AI, I thought it would be an interesting moment to discuss how we might think of the data that we generate, our governments generate, we as individuals generate, companies generate, how that plays out in an age which is increasingly seen to be one of competition between companies providing AI models, competition between nation states claiming capabilities in this area. So you hear much talk of sovereign AI. I also thought we might reflect on what sovereign data is and how that plays into this situation. So the idea is I'll talk for about 20 minutes and then we'll have a Q&A. I'll be questions from Emma and then a Q&A more widely. So first thing to say is when we talk at the ODI about the data ecosystem, but you could similarly understand the AI environment as an ecosystem. It comprises not just one set of elements. You might think it's just all about the compute, all about the data that's available or the chips. Actually, it's often about the energy it takes to run this infrastructure. Of course, it's fundamentally about the skills and talent you have available to put these technologies to work or indeed to build and develop and deployment them in the first place. It's about the research that is always moving the edge of where AI is. To imagine that the architectures we have today are the settled end of a process is to have no sense of the history of how over decades AI has been changed, modified, and supplemented with new techniques, new methods. And how old techniques and methods are sometimes recruited back into modern approaches. It's also about procurement. How do organizations, how do governments procure the tools that now exist in the modern AI ecosystem? And increasingly, it's about an awareness of the importance of governance. And in fact, just in the last couple of days, Demis Hassabis has written a very interesting piece on his appeal to a need for governance across the very most capable models and how that might be organized. So that's the ecosystem. What does sovereignty mean in this context? Now, I know we're joined by people from around the world, but if I just think about this in the UK context, does it mean British ownership or any nationality owning? What does that ownership extend to? Which part of the ecosystem? Is it about the infrastructure that we can maintain and support domestically, whether it's power, whether it's access to the chips themselves, whether it's particular types of data? Is it about the trusted supply chains that allow us to get the sorts of AI services that seem to be increasingly critical to business and to government and to our daily lives? Control over particular critical data that might be used to train or refine models is about being able to procure effectively if the world changes around you. Is it crucially about national security? So there's a lot of dimensions to the concept of sovereignty here. And I think that we always need to ask ourselves and challenge ourselves with the notion of what exactly do we mean by sovereign AI or sovereign data? Otherwise, they can become somewhat sloganized. And we'll be digging into that as we talk and discuss today. Now, this was brought into high relief, I would suggest, by developments just last month. A particular government instructed a frontier model to basically be taken effectively offline. It didn't instruct them. What happened was in June, Anthropic releases Claude, Fable 5, Mythos 5, very capable frontier models. On the 12th of June, the US imposed export controls, effective immediately, no way to verify the nationality in real time. Anthropic had no real alternative but to suspend both of these models for all users. By June the 26th, Mythos 5 had been restored to a set of US organizations. By the 30th, the export controls were lifted. And on 1st of July, Fable 5 was available again. But that whole course of events sent ripples through the international ecosystem. No country outside the US had a say in the decision or recourse against it. And this got companies and countries thinking very hard about assumptions around sovereign capability. Absolutely made and required governments to ask itself whether the understood relationships and licenses that existed between suppliers and consumers could be seen and held to be reliable or consistent into the future. So this was a moment that many had anticipated, wondered whether it could come about, that when it actually crystallized, really got people thinking about the whole issue of sovereignty. At the same time, something very interesting has been happening in the world of AI models. And this is a kind of a rough ranking of where we are at the moment in terms of these very capable models. So the models like Fable, the models like Mythos, the models like GPT-5, Claude Opus 4, Gemini Pro, the proprietary models that the hyperscalers produce are indeed very capable. They're assembled at great cost, huge amounts of data interred, and they are evaluated across a broad suite of benchmarks. This rough ranking is taken from a whole range of benchmarks, GPQA, which is graduate science reasoning, or humanities last exam, which is expert reasoning in particular domains, or the live code bench, which is a coding set of benchmarks. So think of these ratings as an aggregate score. And let's not get too hung up. But what's notable about this is that you'll see that the leaderboards are the very largest models, so-called proprietary models, where the weights of those models aren't available for download. Effectively, they are proprietary to those who trained and built the models. But increasingly, open weight models, and increasingly open weight models that are much smaller than the very largest foundation models, are performing extremely well on a whole range of benchmark tests. Notably DeepSeek, Gemma 4, which is distilled out of the Gemini products, or Qwen 3, Mistral Small 5.4 reasoning. All of these models that are much, much smaller than the original, than some of the original models they were distilled from, or indeed much smaller than the largest frontier models, perform very well indeed on these broad range benchmark evaluations. And indeed, by some estimates, the frontier gap is actually closing. So these frontier models, literally in 2003, the open weight models were a good piece behind where the frontier models at the time were. You could argue that that has essentially shrunk through time to the extent that now, in 2026, in mathematics and coding, potentially the open weight models are maybe only 6 to 9 months behind where the frontier models are. It's more extended lead for other classes of reasoning, but it's speaking to a really interesting opportunity here, that these open weight models, these smaller models, have real capabilities. And it's leading companies and countries that didn't think that it was necessarily feasible to build a very large foundation model from scratch, to imagine whether they can build out from these other classes of smaller model a sovereign capability, or what might that look like. The challenges in any countries thinking about building sovereign capability, and the UK is no different than many other countries in this regard, is access to the compute, access to the data centers, and access to the energy itself. For example, in the UK, we simply don't have access at the scale to the very largest models require for compute to train the very largest models. Our capacity is limited in the data centers, and the cost of energy makes training these models on our sovereign territory extraordinarily expensive. So one of my colleagues at Oxford, Jakob Foster, I'll be talking about their project shortly, asserts that the UK simply cannot win the global AI race by simply trying to outspend the largest technology companies on data compute. So what does that imply might be a route forward? Well, it suggests that perhaps a mid-range model, we're talking models here that are counted in the tens of billions of parameters, trained on particular data that is specific to a country or a sector, could perform sufficiently well to be a candidate for adoption within sectors, within the economy, within policy, within research, and within intelligence institutions. So here the question isn't just whether a model is built here, but how is the capability to do that distributed? It doesn't require that we have to compete at scale, which is where compute and energy constraints bite. You could train it on data that, for example, the UK holds and governs and can account for. And it provides an interesting counterweight for this worry around complete dependence on other nations' models. Now, along the way, it happens that a couple of labs have recently been funded to reduce some of that dependency, partly by a recognition that in the UK, we want to support fundamental research in AI labs. Two labs funded with £60 million of funding have been announced. The SOFARE lab, led by UCL with Cambridge, Oxford, Edinburgh involved, and the BOLD lab, led by Oxford with UCL and Imperial. Each of these with slightly different emphases, one of them focusing explicitly on next generation open source AI designed to run on a very wide range of hardware so that advanced tools don't depend on just a small number of model providers. The BOLD project is rethinking about how these systems learn and how they adapt without vast centralized compute power, which includes thinking about physically embedded robotic contexts. And you can think about this in terms of both of these initiatives looking to reduce dependence on a small number of model providers. And in earlier talks I've given in this space, I've often talked about the realization that AI models are speciating. We always think of the very largest models, the ones that are driving the chatbots we interact with, as being where huge amounts of attention and capital is being invested, which is true. But there are very many other variants now being used in everything from scientific research to particular sectoral implementations. Now, there is a paradox in all of this because we've talked so far about the nature of the models. It's to think about the data on which these models are trained. So at the ODI, we've always argued that that openness of certain classes of data is in itself a public good. And it is precisely that data and other data that the largest platforms have used to help train their models. The concern for many is that what do they put back? Whether it's Wikipedia or open government data or open source software or scientific publications published under open access protocols or the open web itself. All of these were built so that benefits could be broadly shared. But the business models that we now see rather reward extraction. And there's a pattern here and that doesn't just... It worries us that this level of appropriation super concentrates the value in these public goods And how do we deal with that when we're actually advocating for open publication of data? I should say this is a discussion you often hear when talking with colleagues in the global south who really rather regard, if you like, the northern hemisphere as taking data and monetizing it and returning very little to the people the data is about. We've always had this tensioning between making data available and understanding how it is going to be shared. And so if you actually take some of the best examples of commons that have been built by public contributions of effort and time, as the Wikimedia Foundation point out, whilst their content is free, the infrastructure they run on is not. If you think about the growth in bandwidth for multimedia downloads, huge amount of this is driven by scraper bots rather than human readers. It speaks to a world in which the automatic extraction of content for large-scale training is part of the model. And 65% of the commons, the most resource-intensive traffic is coming from bots against around 35% of total page views. And then the question arises, if we as contributors believe that our work is simply being taken, then the reason to contribute potentially gets diminished, and the pool of human-generated data that models depend on could decline and diminish. So this is something, the paradox that we're confronting. How, indeed, do we think about maintaining this equity of the data commons? Now, you might say we've been here before. It's more or less exactly the same story that we saw with the emergence of the most successful search companies. The open link structure of the web, the thing that Tim Berners-Lee gave us, was exactly the resource that was harvested at enormous scale by Google, for example, to build, using its great engineering and the PageRank algorithm, to build a searchable, indexable web. And that has brought huge amounts of benefit to users and, of course, huge amounts of value to the company itself. Would we rather not have that open link web? Clearly not. It drives many benefits. But are there other sorts of arrangements we could imagine? And are there certain classes of data which may be accessed through the web, the terms for which might be negotiated differently than simply making it available, or indeed presumed to be extracted without licensing being attended to or respected? So we get into this area where the argument is a very live one at the moment, and it's around the national data assets that different countries prize and help construct, that these assets should be paid for, not just given away. If we think of the BBC archives, it's decades of publicly funded material, one of the most valuable training resources in the country. How might we think about licensing this on terms that return value to the people who paid for it? This is a great sovereign asset. How might that work? And unless we control the data, Bibun Kidron in her very compelling book, Users, unless we control the data, then we end up being controlled. So contracts with large technology suppliers have to be thought out really carefully here. They look good on paper while amounting in practice to a form of extraction and dependency. Now, this is a very live tensioning, and I'm not here to suggest it's simple to resolve, but we can think about being much clearer when data is used that has and originates from a sovereign country, being very clear that that data is attributed, that its provenance is clearly stated, that we know where it came from and who made it, that the licensing isn't a nice to have, that the terms are developed for AI use, not retrofitted back onto it, and that there are ways where we can imagine attribution flowing back to contributors and funders. And that is something where I think we will need to put a lot more thought. If we are to seriously think about sovereign AI capability, it will be built off the back of sovereign data assets. Now, of course, the arrangements you have with the country and which generates that sovereign data may look very different to those who use it externally. And within all of this, we have to balance the notion that we don't want to destroy the fantastic economies of scale that have led to the web world we live in. The point about asserting a degree of sovereignty is that you can get to choose differently later. If you at least design and build your national data libraries using open standards and interoperability, if we build your data libraries and archives with portability and exit routes built in, if you build them with trusted international collaborations rather than in isolation, and if these systems are under democratic control, that there's a balance between government suppliers and technologies, then you have the opportunity to build essentially a more equitable data ecosystem, which is, after all, the driving mission of the Open Data Institute. And in our book, As If Human, one of the things that Roger and I argue for strongly is that the future of humanity can't be decided in private by vested interests, that the technology we have now cannot be a form of new enclosure that destroys the commons. So when we talk about sovereignty here at the ODI, what we have been doing is working with a range of countries actually on what we call the AI Ready National Data Library. We've built one for the UK from various government sources, illustrating a minimally viable product about how you can get national assets that are highly well assured to support reasoning and AI applications. For the systems themselves, the AI Data Transparency Index measures what AI developers disclose about their training data. Citizen Query checks whether models used in public services answer citizens correctly. So we think there's a really important role in understanding the quality of the data that's being used in these AI systems. And for people and communities, the ODI is stewarding Solid, which is an open web standard that lets individuals and communities hold and control their own data. So we've got a range of work here at the ODI relating to sovereignty. But I've been talking for about 4 minutes now. So I think I'm going to stop here and turn back to Emma for some questions about some of the issues just raised here. Thanks very much.
Nigel, thanks ever so much. So I'm going to start off with this question about a question about frontier models, and the challenges that face the UK in building one, which, from what you've just said, doesn't seem to be perhaps as much of a problem as many of us might have supposed. But I wonder whether do you see this as being a forever problem in terms of our the infrastructure that we don't currently have to build one of these frontier models, or is it just a now problem? I.e., could you see a future in which that might be possible for, the UK and I guess other nations to gain an advantage there?
Yeah. Sorry. Could you see, have I stopped showing the screen now? You just,
You have, yes, we can
yeah.
just see you. Yeah. Do you want me to ask it again?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Well, I think it's both. I mean, I think it's a bit of both. Some of the constraints are likely to persist for quite a lot of years. I mean, people do talk about the challenge of getting energy policy sorted out in the UK. Maybe it's not the same everywhere. Capital cost is a real issue. We know what the challenge is. Research talent, having a real flow of capability to build these models is ongoing. Market scale is always a bit of a challenge for us. So, having said that, whilst we've got a bit of a now problem when it comes to compute availability, within a number of years, I would say maybe 5 years, you're going to have more suppliers, more chips, more growth zones. So that'll help reduce the bottleneck. I think imagining that as of now, all of these barriers are just unscalable would be a counsel of despair.
Mhm.
If you take electricity, yeah, we know that power is likely to be a persistent problem. And I think energy strategy and AI strategy do become inseparable. I think that's something governments are going to have to grapple with, where they derive that from. Problems around the capital, where do we raise capital in our various markets could be an ongoing challenge. If I take something like where do you get the training data from? I mean, here the UK in particular is in a good place. And each country will make a different assessment. I've talked about the BBC, Public Broadcasting Archives, National Archives, British Library, NHS, Parliament, Scientific Publishing. We've got many, many extraordinary assets. The trouble is they're somewhat fragmented, and we've got to think about a strategy that integrates them together. On the talent front, the UK has got great pipelines training graduates and people who would be needed in this new space. I think that we will see an issue that could be gripped quite immediately, which is around procurement. I mean, unfortunately, the UK's instinct is always to go and buy from having failed to scale the companies that might actually achieve the benefit here, they go and procure from somewhere else. So, thinking about actively trying to support your sovereign industries, because we are seeing an age in which many, many startups with many promising ideas are being derived at small scale and then being able to be leveraged very quickly. But do we have the capital markets that takes us around? So there are a number of things to come out here. I don't think there's one way of dissecting this out.
Mm. And I think this you might already have answered this actually, but Vlad Nibolson in the audience has asked Nigel, as and if the UK cannot and should not replicate frontier model scale, where does it have the strongest defensible advantage? I mean, you talked about the data and the skills and entrepreneurship and all of that. I'm just wondering, if which of those things gives us a sort of an advantage in the market.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think, well, what we're seeing, for example, what we're seeing in China is an interesting departure here. Rather than the very, very, very large models, they do have the capacity to build these. They're building, if you will, sector-specific models. So, models that are trained and tuned for particular parts of the economy and then integrated into their workflow. They're doing this in public service as well, like health and transport. So, and there are two examples there, I think, where the UK could precisely follow this kind of model, some tens of billions of parameters models that are integrated into our economy. We are seeing that there is a challenge in integrating the largest models seamlessly into the workflows of business, and the notion that smaller tune models that are sector specific, the things that could be produced to support, for example, the scientist at their workbench, or the engineer in their laboratory, or the person working on material selection in an engineering company. These are possible. Yeah.
We've got quite a lot of questions coming in from the audience, and I want to get through as many as we possibly can. So I'm going to continue with those audience questions.
Yeah, okay, sure.
Yep. So I've got them in front of me. An anonymous audience member has said most of the models competing with the closed frontier models are open weight, for example, Mistral, not open source, i.e., still trained on proprietary data, little transparency on training process. Do we know how well open source models, i.e., those by A12, are performing? And how much do we need to consider true openness for sovereignty?
Yeah, well, I mean, whatever you end up doing with those fully disclosed open models, they come with some advantages. I mean, the advantage if you know and are assured what the training data sets were in the original case, where they came from, what their provenance was, and then produce essentially using open source software, produced open weight model. That fully audited process gives you strong insights about what the qualities of these models are. I mean, there is, just for example, there is a concern that models of all shapes and sizes are susceptible to what's called poisoning. So, with relatively small numbers of documents, these models can effectively be poisoned in such a way that they become insecure. And results fairly recently published, show that hundreds of documents in 30 billion parameter models are enough to cause real problems. Which brings you back to the question of assurance. Where were they injected? How were they injected? And of course, this was actually a controlled experiment that did that, showed that you can actually do this explicitly. So I think we've become very much aware of what the advantages of at least running examples to understand what the impact of different styles and strains of data is. And there's also, not just in the pre-training, but in post-training, we know that there are all sorts of effects that arise, what's so-called curriculum effects, that result from the way in which models are exposed to the order of particular additional training and refinement material. So there is a huge benefit in research that is undertaken in the clear. Are there places where that actually implies that you would want a large scale effort to build a fully open model? And I think you might be back to issues around assurance and confidence in the models.
Okay. So slightly different direction now from Steve Ramage, who asks, France and Spain have recently made their positions clear on software sovereignty that extends to AI. How do they balance governance benefits of AI and software sovereignty, such as data security and legal autonomy, against the capability risks of restricted access to leading global non-European AI ecosystems?
That is
Mm.
that is the policy question. How do you balance those off? Because the concern is that yeah, will this close off innovation potential, not having access to these non-European models, or is the concern for jurisdictional control sufficiently important to essentially impose constrictions, restrictions on the models you choose to employ and deploy? And that will vary by sector. It will be vary by public and private domains. But I think you will see a separation out of different ways of governing and regulating these models. I think it's for nation states themselves to kind of come up with those determinations, because there will be advantages and disadvantages. And I think the story we opened with, the question around that temporary imposition of export control, led people to think it wasn't just a matter of innovation, it was a matter of critical access. But again, you can argue that whilst those very leading models were made available, the models generations back were accessible throughout time. So there's this notion about what is the capability we actually require for the tasks that we need to run various parts of our economy and services. And it will not be the same everywhere. And some of these models will live as edge computing artifacts on our watches and phones and laptops as much as they will from large source models on the cloud.
Excellent, thank you. An interesting question from Sarah, which kind of could slightly border on philosophical. How are the UK and other countries with strict data privacy regulations and high research ethical standards going to scrape the World Wide Web legitimately to create these frontier models?
Yeah. So that's the question. I mean, those who have tried to respect licensing and IP, what rewards that behavior? And of course, what you really need are, you might also argue what you could be looking for here are coalitions of the willing, where
Mm.
there are essentially groups of countries whose sovereign assets taken together become very, very kind of serious and consequential, who are willing to respect each other's licensing frameworks or licensing conditions. And again, the idea that you need, I mean, again, one of the challenges that models are facing is the availability of new classes of data to train the models. Now, depending on the nature of the reasoning required, people are beginning to imagine that a lot of new rich data will emerge from embedded robotics or so-called world models or synthetic data where the models themselves generate data. The argument then is there are still plenty of assets under corporate and national control, which are regulated, that can be regulated, and that can be made available under fair use terms or other forms of usage. And that is a debate we should be in. We shouldn't just imagine that it's all gone.
Mm.
That in the same way that we can imagine that we can preserve the value of resources like Wikipedia or GitHub, where the issue is how do you ensure the integrity of contributed data and understand that its origin and provenance is sufficient and it's being licensed appropriately and harvested appropriately. But that's a great question. I think it is one that we do need to think about hard. But to imagine that the argument's lost at this point is to perhaps understate the amount of data that is still held
Mm.
institutionally, privately, and publicly.
Very interesting. Thank you. So Jack Hardings, who's a former colleague from the ODI, has asked two questions, but I'm picking one because we've got so many coming in. Um, Jack's asking, as more governments and other data stewards respond to AI with different technologies and legal tools, how will we differentiate between appropriate controlled access versus artificial scarcity slash enclosure or sovereignty versus isolationism? The definition of openness was never truly black and white, but it feels even grayer now.
Yes, and I think yeah, I mean, Jack's got an absolute point there. I mean, the arms race that is the attempt to extract or protect has always been there. You know, new and novel ways of thinking about how you might protect. Um, the interesting thing here is that often I think what we forget is that there's a need to be not just engineer the technology, but the institutional relationships that actually work here. And one of the questions is, you know, how do you reward companies who make their data available? The BBC archive, for example, we talk about using it to help build LLMs rather than just, how would they do that? Would we give a one-off training license? Would we do a royalty on model revenue? Would we build a national AI data trust where you get the BBC National Archives, a bunch of people pooling it into a trust? Do we think about compute for content or these organizations themselves building foundation models, at least in the sense of mini models that could encapsulate, if you like, the BBC view of the world. It's entirely possible that these variants might come into view, and it's only going to make the kind of range of various settlements that Jack's describing a richer spectrum rather than clearly segregating out. It's always been a challenge to work out how you preserve the commons in the face of the fact that it costs money to produce these products and these goods. In some cases, it's the business of government in the services they deliver to just produce this data, and we can see it as a virtuous reuse. In other cases, it's been large amounts of taxpayer funding over the years where there's a genuine argument to return back. I don't think we've got fully settled models on how you can make the economics work. But in an ironic sense, this world of change and innovation is a chance to reimagine those technologies, not just for kind of, creating artificial scarcity, but actually creating new kinds of marketplace.
That's a really lovely segue to the next question, actually. Completely accidental, but really good. So Chris Stanny has asked, with such a huge number of tweaked and open models available through repositories such as Hugging Face and LLMs being able to guide less tech-savvy people able to use them, do you think we'll see more SMEs expanding into creating their own sovereign space? And what are the risks?
Well, I mean, say so. In that sense, this speciation I talked about is just going to be a fact of the matter, and what kind of selection pressure will there be on these models? What kind of rewards and incentives will they respond to? And again, I think the interesting thing is to see how throughout the history of AI, this has been this tug and pull between general purpose capability and exquisite task specific engineering. And so the companies that understand a particular business need or particular task extremely well may feel and have data assets to back it up or can license or contract into them, can build this very capable service for a particular micro yeah, think of it as a microservice. That becomes a new kind of compositionality. In an age of agentic deployment, the idea that you can determine which of these models to swap in and out, and what kind of marketplace that looks like, becomes again a genuinely interesting innovation space.
Mm. That sort of idea of speciation, I think, is probably a little bit around the next question. Is it part of the sort of thinking? This is James Evans. He asks, do we need to be bolder in how we approach compute architecture, given the environmental impact and local resistance, or lack of local awareness of the impact of data centers? I.e., you mentioned physical environment, and could this innovation help expedite AI sovereignty?
Well, part of the bet or hope for the kind of investments that UKRI is making and other research councils, I'm sure, around the world we're making is um, the current architectures are wildly extravagant. Okay, so
Mm.
with various innovations that have been made, the so-called mixture of experts model, which only activates part of these very large models, you get more performant, more efficient performance. The idea that tokens cost you something, so you need to be thoughtful about what you spend through, or that you can reduce the size of the model dramatically and make it more efficient, or maybe move to a different style of representation altogether. These are exactly the ideas that if you look at the Bold laboratory that has just been launched and some of the projects that are being proposed in the SOFAIR project, they're exactly exploring how can we make these models more efficient. And it's kind of what happened along the way, ironically, to get us to the point at which we now have architectures that support these massively energetic systems, was the recognition that you could do neural computing on much less precision than traditional computers supported. So that looked at the time like it massively reduced the actual compute burden, and of course, it just exploded the need, the opportunity cost somewhere else. So Yeah, this is a key area of work where the efficiency of computation, what you need, how you deploy, how much context is actually required, is a very active area of research.
Mm. Slightly different tack here from Sarah Cowley. Should we collaborate with the EU regarding sovereign AI?
Well, I think there are many potential collaborations that could emerge. That is certainly one. I mean, I think the natural um, ability to look at some asset data classes, and again, it's not such an extraordinarily long time ago when we were actually collaborating with the whole work of open data collectively together. So there's certainly areas where you could do that. But I think that these opportunities don't just exist within that jurisdiction. I think they exist across the piece. If you look at laboratories working in this area. I think there will be interesting, opportunities for collaboration with, for example, Singapore, with, for example, Gulf states, with, for example, South Korea. There are lots of people who are looking at these sovereign capabilities, not just within the Western European context, but I'd be very surprised if there wasn't efforts to look at where we can do shared work. And in fact, some of the discussions around the use of Mistral, for example, as a baseline model, there won't be one unique sovereign pathway. There'll be a number, yeah, of sovereignties to support.
Yeah. So we've got just under 10 minutes left of our time. So I really can't see that we're going to get through all of the questions, but we'll try our best to cover off as many as we can. Somebody did ask about the environmental implications in the context of the climate emergency of AI. I think you've touched on that already, so I'm not going to take that question. I'm going to focus on new topics. So Nilton Cardoso has said, Sir Nigel, how do we address both the governance risk that powerful actors might capture AI's social benefit and the technical risks that NIST has documented, such as data poisoning, adversarial attacks, prompt injection, and harmful bias that could undermine trustworthiness and enable manipulation?
Yeah, and I think I mean, just on that final point, I think that technical laboratories like NIST, like AISI in the UK, are exactly what you need here. You need labs with very capable folk who understand how to explore the threat surface of these models, how to run due diligence over them. And Demis is advocating for a particular route through the US, to deal with the very largest US models. But I mean, and he says he recognizes himself, you'd ideally want to see that expand to something more internationally managed.
Mm.
And yet the idea that we can remain in this relatively well, there is governance. We witnessed the governance in June when the US turned effectively turned off access from one of the providers. But is that the right kind of governance? It was. We can argue about what the actual originating concerns were, but we clearly do need to be in a position where we can make informed decisions at the technical level about the risks and merits of particular model releases. Ideally, that would have a joined up capability because we have to have some way of managing a situation where if these models did turn out to have unintended consequences, or a set of properties that were seen quickly to be very undesirable, how do we work together as nation states, even when we may be deeply competing in many senses? It is not in our interest to collapse our global trading relationships, for example, using these models. So it will be important to carry on developing in this The two are not inconsistent. The idea to develop sovereign capability is not to imagine we all throw up the ramparts and work in these absolutely walled gardens. It's to understand that actually what we do want to do is not find ourselves just subject to a particular form of coercion through a lack of variance or a lack of understanding. We all need to be intelligent customers in this emerging AI ecosystem.
Mm. Interesting one from Cass C here. They ask, I'm curious about the external message coming from parts of the government that seems to be very naive about engaging with the frontier models rather than building a homegrown open model, as in the Netherlands with GPT-NL. He'd love to hear, or they would love to hear your thoughts. It was quite interesting. Emma Coleman, who previously was a colleague at the ODI, wrote a piece that kind of touched on that in Computer Weekly earlier this week, as framed as a letter to Andy Burnham. It would be fascinating to hear whether you think I mean, you appeared at a select committee not that long ago, Nigel. It'd be interesting to hear where you sit on this particular issue.
Well, I mean, I think it's no surprise that, along with others, we're advocating for a degree of agency in this space and self-determination. I talked about the kind of, if you like, the stack earlier on. Everything from energy to compute capability to data and so on, and having the talent available. If we don't have an environment in which we can understand how to build these artifacts, how these artifacts are built, even if we're not training the very largest ones ourselves, then we're in a position where we are, well, we can't be intelligent customers, as I say, and we're in a position where we can't, even if we chose to, exercise a right or an ability to provide a sectoral solution using one of these models.
Mm.
So I absolutely think there's a strong case for a class of models that are highly capable, which is why I was making the point at the beginning that capability gap is on the order of months in some cases. So let's understand what that means for us. It means that we can build really quite adequate systems in some key areas where we would then have demonstrable agency and local versions of systems we wanted to keep running. The idea that we should only take from one provider or that certain class of providers have all the solutions we need does not necessarily serve us well historically. And at the very least, we should be in a position where even if we did elect to procure in a particular way, there's an ability to gracefully withdraw and replace those providers. And the challenge in modern widely deployed software systems is they are deeply intermingled with many, many aspects of our digital ecosystem. And extraction can be hard even when you're trying with best efforts, particularly if parts of the code bases are running proprietary closed source software. You don't have access to rights of termination or rights of competition for the services that are being procured. We want open marketplaces where there is a choice before us.
And I think on that note, we couldn't have thought of a better concluding line from you, Nigel. That was amazing. Thank you very much to you, Sir Nigel Shadbolt. Thank you to the audience for joining. I'm so sorry we didn't get to all of the questions that were asked. Before everybody leaves, I just want to flag up our next few webinars here at the ODI. All the details are on the website. We have Solid World coming up, the July 2026 edition. Building Solid 26 apps via agentic commerce. That's on the 29th of July. We have number 14 in our data ethics professionals series, a smarter way to spot data and AI harms on the 30th of July. We have data ethics professionals number 15. I'm sorry. Can we share confidential health data in the public interest? That will be a fascinating one on the 24th of September, and lots more to come. So thank you again, Nigel, for sharing your insights today. Thank you for everyone who attended and being, such a brilliant audience as
There are
always.
great questions in the chat as well. I hope we archive
Fabulous
those
questions.
because we
Yeah.
might try and get around to some of them.
Yeah, David has been doing a brilliant job behind the scenes and gathering them all, and we will share them, and hopefully we can get some answers for folk. So thank you very much indeed, everyone. Enjoy a lovely warm evening, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.